Okay, recording is in progress, so that means we're starting, right? Okay.
Good morning, everyone. It's good to see you. I know that you can hear online. It's just so great to be in person. And I will remind you that our next time in person will be with Cantor J, and he'll be talking about Bob Dylan and his music. So invite your friends and family. That's going to be great. We'll also record it. And if you're not here, I get you the recording. Really, our speaker this morning needs no introduction, but that doesn't stop me from giving an introduction. Rabbi Ike Serotta has been a rabbi these many years, 26, 27 here.
25, I think, here.
Okay, 25. Oh, it's 20th, right. So 25 here. But maybe some little known facts. Did you know that he majored in film in college and went to the University of Wisconsin? And go Badgers. I didn't go there, but my money did, sending 2 kids. And so when you come to the movie group, which you'll see it sometime this year, he has great insights into that. And also, this is really the main thing, he also has an education part of his rabbinical degree and has the letters Reformed Jewish Educator, as I do, RJE after my name. And that, of course, is the most important to me. And I'm sure to you and all your kids who went through everything with Rabbi. So with no further ado, and I know that you're all here because we want to know, what is that one Hebrew word? And either you can let people listen to the recording if you don't want to tell them, because they should hear from Rabbi Serotta.
Thank you, Vanessa. It's nice to be here. One of my classmates is here today from rabbinic school, by the way. Rabbi Susan Marks and her husband Bruce have recently moved to the area. So Susan grew up on the south side of Chicago, I think, right? And so new to the north side, but welcome back. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today, we're actually going to talk about the Hebrew word for decency. So we'll get to that in a minute. I'll keep you in suspense just a little bit longer and tell you I've been lucky enough to study with some amazing teachers and professors over the years. And everything that's good in what I'm talking about today comes from my teacher, Rabbi Michael Marmer. Anything that's not so good is probably what I've added to it. So Michael Marmer is a fantastic teacher, and he's working on what I suspect will ultimately be his magnum opus of Jewish philosophy and theology. And he calls it the periodic table of Jewish studies. So here's the actual periodic table. But if you can imagine the way Dr. Marmer sees it, if there was a Hebrew letter in each one of those boxes, right? And so those are the elements of Hebrew, right? And when you combine elements together, you get other kinds of things. So anytime you take letters and put them together, you create meaning, right? And this is an amazing chemical thing if you think about it, right? It's in fact, think about the word element itself, like, which if you look up the word element and you want to know the etymology of the word element, there is no etymology for the word element. No one really knows where that word comes from. The word element, we know what it means. It's come to mean matter in its most basic form. It probably goes back to the 4 ancient elements, you know, earth, air, fire, and water. But scholars suggest that it's possible that the root for element is the letters LMN. Okay? So you can see what I mean, this idea of just you take 3 arbitrary letters, put them together, they become the chemical formula for a word, right? So this is how Hebrew is built. Hebrew is built almost entirely on 3-letter roots, right? Taking 3 of those basic building block elements of language. And by putting these arbitrary symbols together, you get meaning, right? Now, so you take these three Hebrew letters, Hey, Gimel, Nun, and put them together. And I hope you'll find over the course of the talk today that those three letters can be vocalized in different ways. So they can have different vowel sounds, but when they come together in this form, they have some connection to decency. So let's look at, to say one other grammatical thing before I go on. Certain letters in the Hebrew alphabet, right, are considered to be weak letters. So occasionally a letter will drop out of a root in certain kinds of situations. So for example, Hey, Gimel, Nun, the Hey is a weak letter. So it sometimes drops out. So for instance, a word like Magen, which is a word that probably you're familiar with. We sing it in the Avot, Magen Avraham, right? You also may know it from Magen David Adom, right? Israel's Red Cross, or just Magen David, you know, the star of David. But Magen is from this same root, but the Hey is dropped out, right? And Magen doesn't mean star. We say Magen David, star of David, but actually, anyone remember what does Magen actually mean? Shield, right? Who said that? Thank you.
Got a good background.
Yeah, right. The shield of David. Okay. So I want to just suggest, so how is the word shield like our English word decency? I mean, how can a shield be decency? Anyone want to try? Yeah, Floyd. Yeah. So I think that really is how this connects, right? Floyd said that it protects people from bad things, right? So the shield, right? So we're going to have to use our imaginations a little bit when we think about this language and what it means. I would say one way of looking at this is that Hebrew has a relatively small vocabulary compared to English in particular, but other languages. And so there's a pretty broad connotation that these three letters can have. But so one of the connotations it has is shield, that means literally shield, but that shield can also be a symbolic thing and be connected to its basic root of decency, right? And so I'm going to trace this root through a few sources, and you'll see how it's used. And you know, we'll pull it and stretch it around a little bit and see how it equals decency. So I think I'm ready for the first text here, which comes from Midrash, from Sifrei on Devarim, on the book of Deuteronomy. Sifrei is a Midrash, collection of Midrash. So this goes back to the time of the Talmudic rabbis. I mean, the compilation of it goes back to that time. So we're looking at a collection that is about 2,000 years old. So, so here's a story that appears in a commentary on the last parsha, the last portion in the book of Deuteronomy, right? So we don't need the context really, but it's referring to a line in Vizot HaBracha. But here it is. And what I've done is, you'll see in, it doesn't show so well on your screen here, that I bolded and just kept the root in the Hebrew there, right? And so what English word would you translate to fit in where it says Hagunim? A man bought 2 ships, tied them to Hagunim and iron weights, stationed them in the middle of the sea, and built a palace upon them. As long as the 2 ships are tied together, the palace stands firm. Once the ships are separated, the palace cannot stand. So there's an English word that we would probably substitute for hagonim here. What is it? No, so ropes, possibly. Anchor, right? Yeah, right. Yeah. Right. But we will find that hagonim is used, that's the Hebrew word for anchor, right? Isn't it? Yeah, thank you. Native Hebrew speaker, well, not native, but fluent Hebrew speakers in the room. So yeah, so this is the word for anchor, right? So as long as the ships are anchored, I have to stand in front of this too, right? As long as the ships are anchored, then you can build this palace on them. Yeah, Eddie. I think it is related to Haganah, but closer to perhaps the first meeting that we talked about Magen, right? If you look up Haganah, just in case anyone doesn't know, is a branch of Israel's armed services, right? Goes back to 1920, before the state was born. It was born, but it's probably closer to the Magen connotation, right? The shield. Yeah. Right. Well, so that's an accident, right? It's when something sounds like an English word, it doesn't mean you can't write a whole sermon about it, right? That accident, but that is an accident. Yeah. Yeah. Aguna. Now, is that connected? Anchored woman. That's right. Yeah. Thank you. But I'm lucky. I've got fluent Hebrew speakers in the room. I've got colleagues in the room. I've got some help here today. Yeah, an anchored woman, right? That's so it is connected in that sense of being anchored. Now, in this case, I think we see the anchor as a good thing, right? And that it isn't, but so as long as the ships are anchored in a particular place, you can build a palace on them, you can build a society on them, right? So I want to start stretching that into this realm of decency. So so how is decency? We talked about the shield protects us from things. How is an anchor like decency? Yeah.
Well, you have to have decency to build a society.
Right.
And if you don't have consideration for other people and decency, you have chaos.
Yeah. Right. So I'll try to repeat some of that, right? That when you have the anchor, right, then you can build a society upon it. But if there's, yeah. Right, probably the most famous use of this particular passage in the 20th century was, I'm going to forget who it was, but an American rabbi who wrote an article based on this, that the Jewish community in Israel and the Jewish community in America are the two ships. They need to be anchored together in order to build a Jewish community upon them, right? And so, a very interesting way of using this, But so I'm stretching it now into this idea of decency, and we'll see it more clearly as we go. We might make the argument today that we have become unmoored, right? From basic decency, and it's no longer a vision of a society we want to build on the ships, but a memory of a time perhaps when there was some common expectation that leaders, for example, would obey checks and balances in a governmental system, for example, right? And if you like, maybe you can think about the ships anchored together are those branches of government in a sense, right? That are the checks and balances for each other. And so, you know, it's the possibility exists, right, that we have become unmoored from those things. Yeah, Sarah? Yeah, right. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I mean, it's certainly a way of thinking about this, right? What we can build on top of it. Now, of course, we have to start right away. We'd say, is there or has there ever been a consensus on what's decent? Right? And we'll come back to that as we go. But you know, it's pretty hard to define exactly what decency is. And from community to community, certainly from society to society, there's going to be some differences of opinion about what those things are. But I would say that we still have an expectation that politicians will be decent. And that maybe, you remember, Potter Stewart, the Supreme Court Justice, talking about pornography. So he says, you know, how do you define pornography? I know it when I see it, right? So it may be the same thing with decency, right? That's a hand, yeah.
Are the 10 Commandments the standard for decency?
Are the 10 Commandments the standard for decency? I think that that's a reasonable place to start, let's say, right? You know, now, of course, in our tradition, we don't have just 10 commandments. We have 613 commandments in the Torah, right? So whenever anybody says they're, you know, we should post the 10 commandments in a courthouse or something like that, I like to ask which 10, right? You know, so, you know, so we do have some differences even when we get to something that seems like a basic building block. And honestly, I've had the debate in Torah study class about you shall not murder versus you shall not kill, right? And there are differences of opinion about this, right? I mean, when you're in the army and you're fighting a war, right? What part of that command, you know, which command are you supposed to obey, right? So we do have some, even when we get to things that we would consider to be basic building blocks, there is some give there, right? But I do think we expect people to, you know, for example, we accept people to accept the rule of law and the outcome of elections and recognize, you know, it's we might say common decency to concede when you've lost, right? Can we still expect that? I don't know, right? Or if we want to put it in another political place, what about an elected official who's undergoing criminal investigation and decides to change the judicial system? Right? Yeah, yeah. Or trying to put off an investigation until they can't be tried anymore, right?
The rabbi who did the article is Rabbi Bennett Miller.
Oh, great, yeah.
If you're on Zoom, you're gonna get the link and I can.
Okay.
Whoever wants to.
Yeah, Bennett Miller, I think, was a rabbi in New Jersey, as I recall. It was,
From 20.
it's a,
Yes, he's the senior rabbi of Anshe Emmett Memorial in New Brunswick.
so,
He was the national chair of arts.
right, that's, yeah.
That's why he's doing it.
Mhm. So, you know, so that politician, that person, you know, might not think that they are being indecent when they deny the outcome of an election or when they try to change the judicial system. But I would argue that they've become unmoored, you know, and that the ships are drifting and the palace can collapse, right? I saw a hand somewhere. Yeah. Yeah, do laws always equate to decency? There can be indecent laws, right? And this applies to mitzvot in the Torah as much as it does to, you know, local ordinances, right? There are times when what was thought to be decent at some other time in human history is no longer thought to be decent. Right? And so things do change. So that's why I say it's, I don't know that we can simply define decency today, right? But we know it when we see it, and right, when someone behaves indecently, we know that when we see it.
But it's all about perspective.
Their perspective is involved, right? You guys are jumping to the end of the conversation, but that's okay. Mhm.
Okay, what I know versus what somebody else knows are different things.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
and it's a difference is in perspective.
Mhm. A difference in perspective, right? So, so let's keep that in mind, and we'll keep going, right? And we'll come back to it for sure by the end, but let's see. Let's look at our second text here. So this one comes from the Babylonian Talmud itself. And so again, we're looking at texts that were compiled. Typically, I think the age given is between 200 and 500 of the Common Era, usually preserving some stories that have been told from a generation or a few generations before that. So, so this is a question that comes up in the Babylonian Talmud about why the particular group of Levites that was responsible for compounding the incense in the ancient temple didn't teach people how to do that. And here's their response. The members of our ancestral house knew that the temple will one day be destroyed. We're coming up on Tisha B'Av, by the way, the date when we mark the destruction of both the first and second temple in Jerusalem. And they were concerned lest a person who is not mehugan would use it to perform idolatrous acts. So what might you put in here to replace this Hebrew word if you're translating to English, mehugan? I'm hearing decent, you know, I led you there. So yeah, honorable, right? I mean, I think there are different, you know, this is the range of connotation in a word, right? We have to understand it in context. Could it still be anchor in some way? Ordained?
Or trained.
Trained. Okay. So someone who's not properly trained, maybe. Yeah. So could it still be anchor? In the sense of being someone who is not anchored in the tradition, right? No longer moored to the values that we understand, something like that. So now, is that different from decent or moral or something? I mean, I'd say that, you know, our root is sort of coming together, if you like, right?
Alan Diamond says tether.
Tethered. Okay. So, you know, this is what I mean about English having a much larger vocabulary than Hebrew, right? We can come up with multiple words in English that there's only one word in Hebrew for this. I mean, I can't, I don't know. We could probably come up with another Hebrew word too, but, you know, to fit into this context, but, you know, but here was the concern that, you know, what we knew how to do, we can't teach to others because they will use it inappropriately. Right? Let's another political example for you, if you like. Should we get rid of the filibuster? Okay. You know, might be a great thing right at this moment. You know, what happens when the next Senate is elected, right? They may not be as connected to values, right? And so the filibuster was there for a reason. And so it's worth thinking about in this sense, right? So the problem is that the wisdom dies with you. That's the problem with not teaching it to the next generation. But the idea that the person with no anchor might use the secret recipe for incense in an improper way is the reason for not teaching it. You have to understand, of course, in the context of the text itself, the incense matters, right? It isn't just that it smells good. It actually, God gets involved, right? Their belief in the sacrificial system was that it actually caused God's action in the world, right? So the incense is not to be taken lightly in that sense, and not to be used in an improper way, because it would bring God into the equation for something that we don't stand for, right? So so none of these things like ending a filibuster, packing a court, changing a judiciary, right? Those things should not be taken lightly, right? So, by the way, in modern Hebrew, this root does occur. The word, we had our free trade chocolate Shabbat this past Friday night. The word for free trade in Hebrew is hagun. So decency, fairness, right? Kids playing in, might say zelo hagen, It's not. We might just say it's not nice, but it's not fair, right? You're not playing by the rules and things like that. So it does occur in modern Hebrew as well, and really kind of has this connotation of, I would say, decency. When someone says that, they're not saying to the other kid in the playground, "You're not anchored," right? But you're not playing fair. You're not doing the right thing. So. So it has really taken on, I think, much more of this term decency over time. So another text from the Babylonian Talmud. This is in Brachot, and it says that it's from the story of Hannah. Right? Remember that story we read at Yom Kippur, right? Or Yom Kippur. No, is it Rosh Hashanah? Rosh Hashanah, right? Rosh Hashanah Haftarah reading is Hannah, her lips are moving, she's praying, and she gets admonished by the high priest at the time. He thinks she's drunk, right? And usually, of course, when we, the context of the story itself tells us that it's the priest who's wrong, really, for reprimanding Hannah, because she's really just pouring out her heart before God. She's doing what we hope to do on the high holy days, right? To have our prayers come forth and pour out. But the Talmud uses our word hagun when you see somebody doing something that is not hagun, then you're supposed to reprimand that person, right? And we have a lot of literature on this, and it goes all the way back to Torah. It says when you see someone doing something wrong, you're supposed to rebuke him. And there's a whole sort of concept of the sort of the civil rebuke, how to approach somebody who's doing something wrong and tell them that, So how would we translate hagun here? Yeah, we're going to see kosher actually come up in one of these texts, actually, but appropriate, indecent, unfair. Right. Right. Yeah.
But again, there's the perception. You've decided that he's doing something or she's doing something that's not appropriate. But that may only be your perception of it.
Yeah. Yeah, so we always have to keep coming back to this. Is there something that we can say is decency? Yeah. We'll come back to that. I mean, I don't know what that we're gonna answer, but well, yeah.
Protest
Mhm.
to freedom of speech. When you see something.
Yeah.
Then it's a piece. And to me, that's kind of what's going on.
Yeah.
It's almost like an obligation.
Yeah, absolutely. It is. It is an obligation, right? You know, as I said, it's not an obligation to hate somebody or to be mean-spirited toward them, but to issue what you know, the loving rebuke, right? The helping someone see the error of their ways, right? So, years ago, the CCAR conference, the rabbinic conference, was in Washington, D.C. It was the start, I think it's it was the start of the Gulf War, right? After 2001. And a group of rabbis who were at the convention in Washington got together and we wrote a scroll of rebuke to the Bush administration for switching fronts from Afghanistan to Iraq, right? So it wasn't an angry rebuke, it was a loving rebuke was the idea. And we went to the White House and read our scroll of rebuke because it's our right to do that. And we thought it was our responsibility to do that. I see some hands, so Jeff. Hazing, yeah, it's in the news this week, right? So, yeah, do you want to go farther than one word? Yeah.
You know, you're gonna be open for people to go on. And I don't know when, you know, the first person went to the administration, whatever, but obviously hundreds and hundreds of people were witnesses to hazing and nobody. Oh, God, and recommended people.
Yeah, so many people went along with it, you know, and right. I mean, this is something we talk about a lot these days: is don't be a bystander, be an upstander. We say, right? You know, so you know, the person who finally ends it is important, but you know, where were all those people all along who could have done something, right? Who is it who says some are guilty, all are complicit, right? Yeah, Susan. Yeah.
It's funny, it's fascinating that the story actually is the opposite, because the priest Ellie is wrong in this case because she's not young. She's pregnant.
Yeah.
He says, "Okay, well, then why, you know, I shouldn't be here." And it turns out he's wrong.
Yeah.
And yet the lesson from the story is it's good to reprimand someone.
Right.
You know, even though in this case he was wrong.
And the story doesn't really tell us that Ellie, you know, then repented. You know, it's not a story of Ellie's atonement. You know, but there is that element is probably in it too, right? That you can issue the rebuke, be wrong, and then you have to atone for the rebuke that you gave, right? You know, so it would be nice if that was actually in the story, but you know, it's another thing we draw from it. I saw one more hand in the back. Where's the other hand I saw? Yeah.
Okay. This is a worse, but with some people, it almost seems like it's a smart thing to do to go against the spirit of decency. Not everyone is interested. Not paying taxes. It's smart. May not be the decent.
Yeah.
But people are backing up here.
Yeah, and I would say that this is really part of our being unanchored, unmoored, right? Is that we hear people saying in the political sphere that it's all about winning, right? You know, so not paying your taxes becomes a virtue rather than you know, we used to have a family member who would complain occasionally about having to pay taxes, and I would try to say how lucky she was that she had to pay taxes, you know, that she had an income to pay taxes on, right? So, that may not be the way people think about it anymore, yeah? So, and it's just, winning, in the one case, keeping a Supreme Court justice nominee from being interviewed or voted on, and then in another case, turning around and, completely negating the very same argument that I mean, I think we can name names, Mitch McConnell in this room, right? Who, essentially steals, essentially steals 2 Supreme Court appointments, right? Arguing in one case, oh, we never do this right before an election, and then pushing one through right before an election, right? So it's hard not to see that, I think, as being, while some people will see it as winning, I would see it as unmoored, that you could have one or the other of those 2 opinions.
And at one time, it was even the appearance of not being decent was a problem, let alone not being decent.
That's right. The appearance of not being decent was a problem. This one is pretty confounding, right? That politicians who had to drop out of races because they had an affair. Now, this plays on both sides of the aisle, I have to say, right? We've gone from a place where people had to drop out to people being either reelected. Bill Clinton was reelected, to having people admit to, considerably worse things and be elected, right? So, yeah.
What's the fine line between, or in my mind, between using a person or saying that something is inappropriate, but it becomes more of an issue and necessary, I think, when the more a public or a third person becomes involved, because we don't know in the Northwestern case if things were said to this coach individually through the years and ignored. I mean, what point does it become, and then at what point does it become the idea of Lashon Hara, where you're saying something that hurting somebody's reputation? We discussed that a little bit in Sarah, in terms of, where does it go from one level to another?
Yeah, well, these are the hard ethical questions in life, right? But that's why this idea of a loving rebuke is important, and I think most of these things should play out in private, right? I mean, we're talking a lot about politics, and that's the public sphere, but this happens in interpersonal relationships too.
Shabbat service in maybe a more modern Orthodox, and whoever was doing the Torah reading was corrected by the person standing next to them. And I didn't realize that in their culture, that's all it's supposed to correct them. And I saw it as a point of embarrassment for
for the Torah reader, but if you enter into that system, right, there's the gabbai who stands next to the Torah reader and is the one who actually has the vocalized text with the trope marks and things like that, and so is there specifically to help that person. Now some people do it more gently than others, I would say. I mean, I've seen a more gentle gabbai, and and I would recommend that the gentle procedure of fixing the error is the way to go, and I would say that that's probably true across the board, right? That we lobby politicians. I'm back into the public sphere here a little bit, but the goal is, first of all, to say thank you to our legislators who do the things we ask them to do. When we lobby, we're very clear about that. And even when someone disagrees, you send a thank you note after you've met them, right? Because you thank them for sharing their thoughts on a particular topic, even if you disagree, right? This is sort of the etiquette of this now. It illustrates the gentle rebuke in a sense, right? So So that's something that we all should be cultivating in our individual relationships, not just with our politicians. Yeah.
Do you want to go on with your slide, or can you keep asking questions?
Do you have a question?
This might be something we'll get to later.
Yeah.
The boundaries of decency changing.
Right.
LGBTQ.
Yes.
It was considered terribly invasive 20 years ago.
Mhm.
Now is.
Right. Yeah, I think we will get to that. I mean, I don't have a specific slide for it, see, but you'll see it as we go on. I mean, sort of some interesting things that come up. So let me go to the next slide, which comes to us from again now from we saw text from the Sifrei. This is the Sifra. It's also a midrashic collection. It's also from the rabbinic period, so from the time of the Talmud. So we're looking at things from 2,000 years ago. Diane, this is where the word kosher comes up actually in the text, but not kosher in the sense of what they're eating. I mean, it's interesting, kosher in a broader context as well. See if so this takes place, it tells a story about something that happens in Laodicea, which is a part of the Roman Empire, but it's in Turkey, right? And it also refers to a story from the Babylonian exile from the book of Daniel. So you may know this story from the book of Daniel about Daniel and his three friends who are thrown by the king into the fiery furnace, and God performs a miracle and they don't burn, right? They survive this thing. And, you know, we're more familiar with Daniel and the lion's den, but it's a similar kind of test of Daniel's faith. So this is some kind of functionary within the Roman Empire. The name appears in several different forms, actually in different versions of the Sifra. The names of the people that he arrests, Paphos and Lilianus, also spelled differently in English characters in different versions. But this is the basic story. And he arrests them. This, by the way, according to the story, this is a pretty early example of a blood libel, right? A Christian child has been murdered and the Jewish community is accused. And these two, who are not guilty, take the blame because this Tyrannus it's going to punish the whole Jewish community for the death of this child unless he finds the perpetrators. And so these two, Paphos and Lilianus, take the blame for a murder that they did not commit in order to save the Jewish community in Laodicea. So that's sort of the context of the story. But here the officer arresting them challenges it, right? If you are from the same people as Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, these are the friends of Daniel who get thrown into the fiery furnace. Let your God save you from my hand, just as he saved them. By the way, you may know, Daniel and Daniel's friends have their Hebrew names. These are their Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. They also have Babylonian names, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So you may know the story better from the Babylonian names. But anyway, it says, let your God save you from my hand, just as God saved them, right? And the response that Paphos and Lilianus, they challenge this, right? They say, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were suitable. And here's where the word kosher shows up. They were kosher. And Nebuchadnezzar was Hagun, that a miracle be performed through him. But you are a wicked king. You are not Hagun, that a miracle might be performed through you. Right? So, I keep going to politics, but I I knew John Kennedy. You're no John Kennedy, right? Okay. Nebuchadnezzar, that was a king. Yeah. You know, a king who legitimately ruled, you know, the empire that he ruled, and you're not that guy. So, yeah. That's the argument. I think you might be hard pressed to find in Jewish texts really, I mean, in the story of Daniel, for example, a sort of a love for Nebuchadnezzar, you know, so it's a little strange in a way, but yeah, but there is a sense, right? The right king, you know, I mean, you can't say he was elected king, you know, but right, he was the people's king. Okay, you're a colonizer from outside of here. You don't belong here. You know, you're not part of this. So something like that. You're the illegitimate king, right? You're an unmoored human being. You know, you're threatening mass punishment, you know, for this, right? There's a lot of ways to read it, I think, but right, the sense that Nebuchadnezzar was Hagun, and therefore God did a miracle through Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar threw Daniel and his friends into the fiery furnace so God could do the miracle that they would survive. God's not going to do a miracle through you. You're not worth it. You're not moored, perhaps. Yeah. Yeah.
Pretty honest.
Maybe. You know, I'm not enough of a linguist to know. And as I said, the name appears in a couple of different forms. So I can't even really tie it down to a particular guy. So I think it may go the other way, that who's the guy who gives us the word tyranny? Let's put him in this story. Right. So I think that's possible. So you know, we shouldn't necessarily look to the Sifra for actual history, you know, but I do think there probably is a connection between the words, you know. So let's see. So let's take a look at this another midrash. And this is from Bereshit Rabbah, again, you know, roughly 2,000 years ago. And this is on a story that we're probably more familiar with. This is the story where 3 men come to visit Abraham in his tent and tell him that he's going to have a son. And in the text is pretty terse about this. You know, Abraham looks up and he sees 3 men standing near him, and he rushes to greet them and bring them into the house and provides hospitality for them, right? The Midrash adds some context to this. How does Abraham know that these guys aren't just marauders who have come to kill him and take his wealth, right? And so this is the Midrash's answer to that question. Rabbi Levi in the Midrash says, one appeared in the form of a Saracen, one is a Nabatean, and one is an Arab. I think, by the way, this is probably already an anachronism, but I'm not sure. Abraham said, if I see that the Shekhinah, and you may know this word, right? The presence of God, the closest presence, a feminine presence, by the way, a feminine name for God. But, you know, that the presence of God is with them. I know they are Hagunim. And if I see they give respect to each other, I know they are Hagnos, which is from the same root, right? Okay. Since he saw them giving respect one to the other, he knew they were Hagnos. So that's how he knows he should invite them into his tent. He can give them hospitality, and that perhaps what they say is worth hearing, right? So how would you translate these terms here? Upstanding, decent, honest. Did I see a hand over back there? What? Respectable. I would say respectful too, right? You know, that's sort of a key element here, right? That we see that these 3 who come from 3 different tribes, nationalities, you might say, that they are walking along being respectful of each other, not necessarily in perfect harmony or perfect agreement, not necessarily, right? But that they are respectful of each other. When I see that they respect each other, I will assume that they'll be respectful to me too. I mean, it's a very pragmatic kind of thing, yeah? So, and if they don't respect each other, then presumably Abraham reacts quite differently to their approach. So, you know, he sees that they have a certain code of behavior, if you like, right? You might think about this, you know, if we can bring in some modern theology and philosophy, you can think about Martin Buber and the idea of I thou, right? That these people have a relationship that is beyond just using another human being as an instrument for our own satisfaction, right? That they actually have a relationship to each other, and therefore I can also enter into a relationship with them. And so when we're dealing with people who are, at least in our eyes, unmoored, it's difficult to enter into a relationship. And this is something that we're talking about all the time, right? These days. How do we respectfully disagree, right? How do we continue to keep doors open for conversation with people who are not respectfully disagreeing with us, and vice versa, you know, and all that? Yes, Susan.
I'm just thinking as you're talking about the colloquial expression, no honor among thieves.
Yeah.
So that if you see no honor among thieves, they're not.
Yeah, right, absolutely. You know, so and we see this play out in a sense, and sometimes in our own family lives these days. I mean, I've certainly had people come and tell me concerns about things that get said around the Thanksgiving dinner table or Hanukkah or whenever, you know, whenever family gets together. You know, folks who you can't have a conversation with anymore, those sorts of things. And it's right, this of seeing how people treat other people affects how we can respond, right? And how we can be in relationship with them. Yeah, Sarah. So I think there is, right? I'm, you know, I mean, linguistically, there's a difference, right? I'm not sure if my grammar is good enough to tell you the difference, right? So if I know they are respectful, let's say, and if I see that they give respect to each other, I know they are respecters, right? You know, so it's sort of, what's respectful? Is that an adjective? A verb? It's not a verb, is it? A respectful? I guess it is. Yeah, it's a verb. So that's a verb in hugnos and then is a noun, right? So the plural form, and it's also kind of, it's not the modern Hebrew plural form. It's you know, a rabbinic form of plural. So, right. So in one case, it's a verb, and another it's a noun, right? So, but you see that same root, gimel nun hey, appears in both. Yeah. So, yeah. I think you could, right? You could use the word courteous. Yeah, I'm.
Courteous to other people.
Yeah.
So I don't know if respectful.
Right, and you know, and I'm going to throw decent back into it too, right? You know, have we lost the ability to do that? I don't know that we've lost it, but we're not practicing it, right?
Thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, it can be. And so those are sort of particular signifiers of being courteous, but there's sort of a general demeanor, right, of being courteous, respectful, all those kinds of things, and modern culture seems to have coarsened a lot of that. So I don't know that new ways of doing things aren't inherently disrespectful, but they get used in disrespectful ways, right? So yeah, I think it's very much a part of our present day. Yeah. Edie?
The British are expert at using the social convention of being courteous and being extremely snarky when required.
Yeah. She brought up the British in general, I guess, but certainly watching what happens in the parliament, right? They are not always courteous, right? They often make our Congress look courteous, So this does get us back into sort of different cultural norms of what decency actually is. Right?
Says civil, being civil.
Civility. Yeah.
That's the
Right. So I think the connotation, the range of meaning in this word is it's all of these things. I pick decency as sort of the cover-all, but someone else might argue civility is the cover-all, and all these other things are sort of subsets of that. I'm okay with that. It's Janet.
Going back to how we engaging with somebody, and then looking at this notion of respect. I have been going through with some others training and kind of a whole set of skills to be able to do that. And I think because we're working in a nonprofit, we often have people who are on different sides. But how do you be part of that review? It's something that we call calling out and calling in. Calling out is very aggressively saying, no, you're wrong. And calling in is a conversation and one that is respectful. So I think, we were talking about how do you move, kind of in society where there are different groups and different sides, and how do we talk to each other? I think that's part of what we all need to learn.
Yeah.
The respectful way, not to be quiet, but the respectful way to be able to.
Yeah. A respectful way to communicate. I mean, I think that's very important. And the short bursts of things that we know as Twitter, or what's the new one on Threads, right? Those don't really lend themselves to the kind of conversation that you're talking about. Yeah, Marty?
So it might be a little simplistic, but it might be that we get
The golden rule. So in Judaism, Hillel has his version of the golden rule, which is slightly different. It inverts it slightly. It's what is hateful to you, don't do to anybody else. Right? Which maybe makes as much sense as do unto others. But it's interesting. He verses it negative, in the sense that what you don't like. So don't do that to somebody else, right? It's harder to know what somebody else does like, right? But anyway, I have a few more texts. I don't have a lot of time, so let me try and get you through a couple of these quickly. These next two are a little bit close to my heart because my rabbinic thesis was on Reform Judaism and religious divorce. So I spent a lot of time with this text. This is Gittin. This is the laws of divorce in Jewish tradition, right? There's a lot of time spent in the Mishnah and then on in the Talmud commenting on the Mishnah about what makes the Jewish divorce document, the get, legal or not legal. And one of the ways that you can make a get illegal is by what it says here, using the date on the bill of divorce, using a calendrical system that counts years in the name of a kingdom that is not Hogenet. So you simply and this is a deceitful thing to do, by the way, right? To write a divorce document that isn't really a divorce document. You're not really giving your wife a divorce, you know. And one of the ways you would make it an invalid document is you choose a kingdom that is not considered to be decent. Yeah. And by doing that, you have made this document null and void. And then in the Talmud, they commenting on this section of the Mishnah says, what's the meaning of a kingdom that is not Hogenet? So let's say, for example, you're living in the Roman Empire, or you're living not in the Roman Empire, and you use the Roman Empire, the date from the Roman Empire as the date on, that's one. And why is a kingdom called not Hogenet? And because they have neither their own script nor their own language, which that takes some parsing, I think, right? So I do think, I may be wrong about this, but I think Latin was originally written in Greek characters, right? The alphabet as we know it is a later development. But certainly in the early Roman Empire, the lingua franca was actually Greek, right? Before it was Latin. So that may be part of what they're at here, but I would prefer to think of it in more of a metaphorical sense, right? What Janet was just talking about, the inability to communicate. So a kingdom that doesn't have a way to relate to each other, right? Not necessarily just a common language, but something deeper than that. Yeah.
Part of the challenge is that the Roman Empire is so big that there's a lot of different languages throughout the empire. So that there's not one script or one language.
Yeah.
Here they speak Greek, here they speak Coptic, here they speak Syria. So how can they claim to be an empire?
By the way, I think this is one of Susan's specialty areas, actually, right? Is this time period. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense, right? So it can be literally that they don't have a common language. That, so using a kingdom that has no common language, now I wonder if you can take that a step farther to say that those kinds of nations are by definition not Hogenet because they are subjugating others, right? And therefore are not a decent kingdom, which may go back to the one about Tyrannus too, right? That why he's not Nebuchadnezzar, although, the Babylonians certainly conquered a lot of places too, but.
An example in America would be that the white settlers sent treaties over to the American Indians and expected them to sign them when they didn't have command of the language. And what most of them couldn't read either.
Yeah.
So we subjected them.
Yeah. On a lighter note, we lose a common language. I mean, think about, in baseball statistics, what gets an asterisk, right? Because we made the season longer, right? Now there are 162 games. So if you hit 61 home runs, but you had 8 more games to do it in, it's not the same thing, right? And then the steroid era comes around, and right, so we don't put the guys who have hit 60 whatever home runs, 70 home runs in a season in the Hall of Fame, because they did it aided by something that people in past generations didn't have. The alternate argument is that Babe Ruth didn't have to face African-American players, so there's the language ceases to be a common language at some point, right? And so you can't write a get using one of those kingdoms. So can we even talk to each other, right? Have we lost that common language? And if we do lose that common language of what is some sort of agreement on what's decent, then any behavior becomes possible. And language itself becomes a weapon, right? Instead of a tool. You might think of something like there was a bill that went through Congress a number of years ago, the Defense of Marriage Act, which was an anti-LGBTQ measure. But the title, right? And this is, this is the whole, it's 1984, right? Talks about this, taking language and turning it around. Okay, so we're coming close to the end. I have 2 more texts I want to show you, both from the present, relatively present day, 20th century, right? So Rabbi Chaim David Halevi was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Jerusalem, I believe. Okay. He was born in the British Mandate, 1924. He lives until 1998. He was part of the chief rabbinate council. He became chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, actually Tel Aviv Yafo, when his predecessor, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef, becomes the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, right? And so he writes this: the great moral to be derived by every government among the people of Israel is that it possesses an obligation to conduct itself with integrity and haginut, right, toward its minorities and those who are strangers in its midst. In so doing, it will sanctify the name of heaven and the name of Israel in the world. So a call to decency, and the definition of decency is to conduct itself with integrity toward its minorities and the strangers in its midst, right? So and we can apply that in the state of Israel today. We can apply it here just as easily. We're talking about immigration here in our country, right? We have this tradition which this mitzvah mentioned more than any other in the whole Torah is do not oppress a stranger. Remember, you were strangers in the land of Egypt, right? So this sense of haginut is still very palpable and very real in the modern period. And this, let me show you one last text, and then we'll finish with where a lot of you started from. This is a text from Isaiah Berlin. Isaiah Berlin was British, 20th century moral philosopher, an educator. He actually did not, at a certain point in his life, he sort of stopped writing books and things like that, but people recorded his lectures and transcribed them, and it's like then. So this comes from a transcription of a lecture that he gave at, let's see, I think I made a note. I think it's at Oxford. Yeah, delivered at Oxford in 1958. Was then translated into Hebrew. So I would not know this text at all if not for Michael Marmer, who I mentioned at the beginning, who, as I said, everything good in this is Michael Marmer's, so translating this English moral philosopher's spoken word into Hebrew, we get our root one last time today. So if you ask why we believe in human rights, I can say, because that is the only hagun, even tolerable way human beings can live with each other And if you ask, what is Hogenet? I can say that it is the only kind of life which we think that humans should follow if they are not to destroy each other. These are general truths, but this does not assume something unalterable. I cannot guarantee anything against change. Right? So we took this English language speech, translated into Hebrew, and the word Hogenet, Hagun, appears in the Hebrew version of Isaiah Berlin's English language address. So in the English, I think the word there is decency in both places. It's the only decent, even tolerable human beings can live with each other. And if you ask, what is decency, right? So that's what he said back in Oxford in 1958, right? So we come back to him and said that decency may change over time. One of my favorite quotes is Adlai Stevenson, right? Change is inevitable. Change for the better is a full-time job, right? So that's it. We're not opposed to change, and decency is not opposed to change. It's not about going back to some golden age when everybody was decent, right? Because there is no such time or place. And you can see that in our texts too, that people are writing deceitful Gittin, right? The deceitful divorce documents. There's all kinds of things that people are doing wrong. There is no golden age when everybody loved each other and everybody was perfectly decent, or Abraham wouldn't have had to worry about the three guys who were coming up to him and wonder if they were decent, right? And we're not opposed to change in the sense that change can be change for the better. It's how do we make decency change for the better, right? How do we hold anybody to a standard that is actually decent? Is there some bedrock anchor? Now the point is the ship may sail and then you drop the anchor in another spot, right? But without some anchor, without some place that we can call decent in whatever moment in time we might be, right? That then we're just adrift. So that's sort of my final thought on it. I mean, the word that you need to know is hogen, decency. And then it's up to us as community to decide what is a decent way to behave toward others. And it won't be the same as it was in the 19th century. And it may not be the same as it will be in the 22nd century. But we want to place an anchor somewhere and say, we have to continue to care for each other. We have to continue to call out indecent behavior when we see it. The Potter-Stort definition, when we recognize it as being indecent, and try to come to consensus of what are we anchored to. So, any last thoughts? Sorry, Naga?
We need to be mentioned and mentioned.
Mention it, right? In its broadest sense, it includes all humans. Right? Yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's all.
Just a couple, a couple of announcements. One, we are going to have a Tisha B'Av service on when? Remind me, Rabbi?
Wednesday night, July 26th.
Wednesday night, July 26th. Please come down. This is a commemorative, a memorial. It's a fast day the next day. The office said, do we have to have an oneg? I'm like, no, it's a fast day. So there'll be no oneg,
Sorry,
people.
there's no oneg that night. We're
Free eat.
partnering that night with,
Come closer.
we're partnering that evening with Jewish, what's
Children and Family Services.
JCFS, Jewish Children and Family Services.
Woohoo.
So, Tisha B'Av is part of there's a sense of communal grief. It goes back to the destruction of the temples, but it's come to be kind of a kind of a catch-all of grief. So we actually are going to have a couple of grief counselors with us that evening. We'll do some small group work with them, as well as hearing some of the verses of Echa, the traditional Book of Lamentations, chanted that evening, and have a chance to study together a little bit. And Congregation Hakafa is going to come over and join us as well.
On a personal note, I just want to say goodbye to Barbara Turek. This is her last adult ed. She's a fabulous congregant. She's moving to Las Vegas. Don't cry, because I will. And besides being a fabulous congregant, she's from Worcester, Massachusetts, where my husband's from. So that's every time I go, I say to Arthur, Barbara, the one from Worcester. And he goes, right. Anyway, please say goodbye. Nisiat Tova. I would sing Tefillah Hader, but Cantor's not here, so we're not going to do that. Okay, we'll see everybody in a month. Bye-bye.
And Barb, it's just your last time in person.
Right, she'll come online. She's going to come online. Can I give you this? No, I got it.
Sure.
You're welcome.